There is a great horror beneath the manor. A crawling chaos that must be destroyed.
Hello everybody, my name is ElementFive, and today we finally get to dive into the long-awaited and highly anticipated Vermintide mod for Darkest Dungeon. Teased in 2019 and developed by a growing and talented team, this mod is absolutely massive and a ton of fun to play. It is a true labor of love and feels like a free DLC that ends up being considerably larger than the Crimson Court. Now, Vermintide features a ton of new custom enemies, 8 bosses from different regions, a plethora of new and fun additions like trinkets, quirks, potions, curios, new districts, and even disease mechanics which compare to the Crimson Curse, all set and themed around the overrun Hamlet and an entirely new dungeon called the Warpstone Mines. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Warhammer Vermintide, a condensed way to frame it is to follow the format of the popular first-person co-op games set in the apocalyptic end times of the Warhammer fantasy world, which feature a group of heroes fighting endless hordes of an underground race of treacherous ratfolk known as the Skaven. Quote, "The Skaven as a whole are a cruel, treacherous, and highly numerous species that have since spread their loathsome corruption to the farthest corners of the world. And with our Hamlet soon to be overrun, it's clear that the gang's all here, from death runners to sack rats and rattling gunners, even fearsome rat ogres. Familiar faces from the Under Empire are well portrayed and frequently encountered through all tiers of this mod." I got to spend the last week working intimately with the dev team, vigorously testing and replaying as much as possible, and while things are still subject to change, the mod has just moved into open beta, and my goal in this video is to showcase the mod in some detail, shine a light on major features, provide some useful tips, and the basics of how to prepare yourself for the coming tide.
Exposed to a killing blow.
Now, upon loading the mod into your save file, you'll note that the iconic Darkest Dungeon torch is now green, a nice detail and fair warning that the world has changed and that the tide is rising. Now, all you have to do is reach week 8 of your playthrough and you'll receive a new town event called the Menace Below, introducing you to the new dungeon called the Warpstone Mines. Now, you're welcome to provision conservatively for a short introductory dungeon, but if you have the bankroll, I suggest bringing a couple extra provisions early on to begin learning the dungeon's new curios. And what I can also tell you is that Torchlight feels more valuable against the Skaven, shovels have plenty of value in the mine, it's worth thinking about Holy Water for quirk interactions, and you learn very quickly that Blight is a regular theme and a major problem against these enemies if you don't have some form of cure. Now, the first dungeon is a preset map and introduction, and you'll note that the map borrows from Crimson Court style discovery, which I think is a nice touch, sort of playing on the imperfect information and anxiety attached to treading into the unknown. You'll quickly encounter your first set of Skaven enemies, and this is also your first introduction to an interesting new mechanic featured in most of the lesser tier Skaven called the Black Hunger. Now, I personally find this to be a very neat mechanic, and how this works is that once you get a rat's hit points below 70%, it develops hunger, and at the very end of a round will free action eat any remaining corpses for a small battle-long buff and heal over time, scaling with the number of corpses consumed. It only shows up on the Clan, Slave, and Storm Skaven, and feels almost reminiscent of other overhauls with troublesome corpse mechanics, where leaving corpses suddenly feels a bit risky, so you're forced to think about the value of, hitting a rat to just outright kill it, or the risk of damaging enough to make it hungry and waste your turn as it heals and consumes a corpse. Ultimately, it's a feature that rarely feels punishing, and mostly serves to extend the life of otherwise squishy ratties, but handled poorly can become a bit of a problem, especially at higher levels and at the wrong moment. Now, moving along, you'll encounter more Skaven and your first new curios, and it's not long until you come across your first node of ore. Among other things, digging at the ore produces your first bit of Warpstone, a substance which makes murderers of saints, lechers of the chaste, and mutants out of men. And while simply consuming it awards a couple rounds of blight and stun buffs with a small hit of stress, consuming it more than once will have quite a different effect, infecting your character with Warpstone Addiction, a disease which, like a light version of the Crimson Curse, is incurable through normal methods, features different stages of craving with corresponding buffs and debuffs, and is maintained by the regular consumption of Warpstone ore. So it goes without saying then that you'll want to collect this stuff and treat it with value equal to blood vials from the Crimson Court. Now, eventually you'll encounter your first warp-engineered Skaven, denoted by the green subclass and the fact that they look a little more sophisticated. And it can be worth prioritizing these as they act sort of like enemy plague doctors who can really lay on the blight and shuffle your team. And importantly, have a chance to infect a character with Warpstone Addiction. Now, these attributes apply for all warp-engineered variants, many of whom can be a bit chaotic, sometimes using reckless abilities which result in things like accidentally blighting themselves, allies, or, in the right circumstances, exploding. Now, once you reach the altar, you'll get your paws on a nice bit of treasure, a new trinket which gives reduced torch burn and 25% added stun chance against rats. And with the intro out of the way, you'll now have access to regular length and randomized dungeons. And this is a good time to mention that really learning these dungeons and curios can lend huge advantages. While it's well known that scouting is powerful in Darkest Dungeon, I find it particularly useful in the Warpstone Mines given the huge benefit of acting before specific enemies with surprise, in combination with any quest requiring you to complete rooms or altars, and especially for disarming Skaven traps, given that the consequence of these is often that you'll be ambushed by packs of rats laying in wait, and beware that this kind of ambush can happen as a result of negative curio interactions as well. Also worth mentioning is that some specific Vermintide quirks are farmable. For example, dealing a killing blow to basic enemies might award the Executioner quirk. Using the same character to frequently disarm traps in a dungeon can also award the Tunnel Rat quirk. And frequently using medical supplies found in some curios can also award the Field Medic quirk, just to name a few. And generally speaking, Vermintide quirks are pretty fun and interesting. While it's certainly useful to get something like Warp engineered on a character, you might also see something rare like Dawnbringer, which evolves over time, or an equally troublesome negative quirk. Now, things continue to get interesting once you move into the veteran game, as you'll generally encounter more stress, stealth, and new enemy encounters. While rat ogres do appear in apprentice dungeons, the enraged variants will only be found in veteran and higher, and both feel a bit like ghouls or bone commanders which need to be prioritized, lest your team start to really get bullied and stressed out. Storm Vermin are a deadlier, tankier warrior class which have the Black Hunger mechanic, but it's often the warp-engineered Skaven that you'll want to focus on, which even advertise round cooldowns to using powerful spells and buffs. And while warp-engineered variants like fire throwers and gunners can be found on Apprentice, I feel like they're much more common and punishing in higher tier, and sometimes in nasty combination with things like gutter runners for mark synergy. And this run also marked our first encounter with a sack rat, a Vermintide icon, and In Darkest Dungeon, a roaming 1% chance loot goblin with high dodge, medium speed, and HP. It has a high chance to stun your party and attempts to run away after a couple rounds, but as you could expect, drops a decent haul. Eventually, you'll get your first apprentice boss quest, tasking you to kill one outdated Doom Wheel. As mentioned previously, there are 8 unique bosses in Vermintide, 4 primary bosses encountered as you progress the mines, 1 roaming sack rat, 1 triggered only by curio interaction, 1 boss attached to a sort of Brigand Wolf event, and another one found in the Champion Warrens. And while I plan to cover each of these in their own separate breakdowns, they've all been quite interesting. They're well animated, and some are just downright brutal. And though they're still seeing some balance and changes, 8 bosses of this caliber and quality are a massive achievement, and something this team should be really proud of. They're all varied in design, style, and difficulty, and a heck of a lot of fun to fight.
Unnerved, unbalanced.
Now the Doom Wheel feels like a solid introductory boss, which acts a bit like a Brigand Cannon and uses torchlight to increase the accuracy of its powerful attacks, or forces you to keep things dark and face stress mechanics. I think this thing looks and sounds really great, and the kinds of trinket rewards you get for killing these bosses are well worth it. In total, there's over 30 trinkets added with this mod, and I find that a lot of the Vermintide trinkets specifically work well to help counter the mechanics and themes of the vermin themselves. In this case, Cylindrical Box became an instant add for most of my Skaven groups. And since we're on the topic of trinkets, it would be advisable to collect whatever blight resist you can get your hands on, since killing the Doom Wheel triggers the first Vermintide town event, as the rats, agitated by the loss of their machine, are emerging in countless numbers in the old sewers to corrupt the Hamlet. Now, the sewers and corrupted Hamlet are events which feel sort of like Brigand Wolf. The sewers in particular feels like its own dungeon, and both feature plague and monk varieties, which are nasty and bring a lot of riposte and blight damage to your party. Though none of these variants can infect you with Warpstone Addiction, the monks always attack one final time upon death, and the Plague Doctor really shines brightest against these, as the sheer amount of blight damage is enough of a challenge on its own. You'll do a couple of these style quests and eventually get access to a particularly challenging but important boss called the Plague Priest. Now, on first attempt, this boss is a challenging puzzle which has 2 very different phases. It can be frustrating to figure this out, but it's already seen a lot more polish and smoothing out, and I really like the core concept so far, given that this is not just a race and you really have to plan out surviving both phases. And the reward for killing the priest is your first bit of VMark-1, a way to tend to Warpstone Addiction. Now, once you've purged the Hamlet of invaders and defeated the priest, you can continue on at your own leisure pursuing the different quests and apprentice bosses associated with the mines until you clear the veteran Doom Wheel, which will trigger the town invasion again, spawning another round of invasion quests, and once you've completed enough of those, you can go after the champion Plague Priest, which awards the ability to cure Warpstone Addiction in the Sanitarium, and opens the way for a new champion boss to spawn in the Warrens, and a sort of end boss in the mines once you also progress the dungeon to level 7. And while we've sufficiently outlined the basic progression of the mod and how to access its bosses, I still think it's worth examining a couple key features. While Warpstone Addiction plays like a version of the Crimson Curse, I've found it to be a lot less punishing and a bit more interesting. There are 3 primary stages of the disease: exposed, which is sort of the default state, corrupted, which mirrors waning and has a lot of drawbacks, and enlaced, which feels sort of empowered and a lot more rare. And thankfully, you won't have to worry about things like spreading the disease in the Hamlet or characters dying from the disease alone, and there's no pesky fanatic waiting for you should you have a really diseased group. And according to Iris, the disease is made more useful by the way it cycles, and you can often get away with bringing just 1 vial with an addicted hero and keep them not corrupted for the entirety of the mission. Iris also points out that warpstones and infectant enemies only turn up in the mines, so they neither clog up your loot table nor force you to go to mines to get more warpstone. In general, I think it's pretty well handled. I've certainly popped the occasional Warpstone to get an edge in landing stuns and blights, and at times have forced Addiction on a character to work better with a specific Vermintide trinket. And just to summarize, I would remind you to prioritize scouting and blight control against these enemies. Consider the power of stuns and dots against most of the ratfolk, and especially when working around corpses and hunger. And I highly advise that you do not take the champion game lightly. Some of the cloak mashups, blight damage, and stress damage featured in the champion levels of this mod can be absolutely devastating. And this goes especially for a couple of the late game bosses. A couple of these bosses in particular are easily some of the most brutal fights I've endured in Darkest Dungeon, and they're purposed to be that way. A sort of trophy boss awaiting you once you feel like you've really figured out the mod and mastered the game. Now, thankfully, installing Vermintide is quite easy. Just follow the link below the video to the Steam page, subscribe to the mod, and load it into a new or existing save file. Now, do be aware that there are a handful of known conflicts outlined on the mod page, and things are still in open beta here, but this already feels quite polished and very close to a 1.0 release. And I'd like to close here by just giving a gigantic thank you to Shallow Iris, who held my hand this week through a ton of detail and information through all of our testing and recording, and a very well-deserved congratulations to the team who've been developing this incredible project over the last 3 years. I really think this is something special. This much content and level of quality is a real achievement, and I hope this team remains encouraged to keep adding to this and continue to improve it down the line. I've spent easily 100 hours playing this mod already, and I've spent many hours playing Warhammer Vermintide over the years, and this mod really captures a lot of the theme and charm about what made that world a lot of fun, and feels very well paired to Darkest Dungeon. And with all of that said, thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you think about this mod in the comments below, and do let us know if you have any questions or aspects that I forgot to mention. Make sure to subscribe for more incredible mods, news, and everything else Darkest Dungeon. Join us on Discord, and keep an eye out for the coming boss breakdowns I'll be doing for this mod in the new future, and I sincerely hope to be streaming a playthrough of this mod come the new year. Thanks everybody, we'll see you next time.